Picture this: high-gloss Italian marble, ceiling-to-floor glass looking out over the harbor, and 22 directors in $5,000 suits holding their breath. In the middle of that silent room, a crisp $100 bill spins twice through the air and lands right against the tip of Arthur Pendelton's scuffed leather shoe. And then CEO Victoria Thorne, 34 years old, dressed in tailored ivory silk, standing at the head of a mahogany board table built by her grandfather, looks down her nose at him and says, "Pick it up, Arthur. Pick it up, take your petty $100, and get your old coat off my floor." Now, you have to understand something about Arthur Pendelton. Arthur was 59 years old. He had 32 years in structural risk compliance, a faded 1998 leather satchel he'd carried since his late wife passed, and hands that still knew how to turn a wrench because he'd started his career on the shop floor fitting commercial turbine casings. He didn't blink. He didn't flush red. He didn't even look down at the money by his shoe. He just looked Victoria straight in the eye and said, "Your $150 million empire is already dead. You just haven't smelled the smoke yet." She laughed in his face, of course. The whole board laughed. But what Victoria Thorne didn't know, what nobody at that mahogany table knew, was that just minutes earlier, an automated banking cross-check had already started counting down. The man she had just fired and tried to humiliate was the only person in that entire tower who held the key to stopping a complete financial execution. 6 hours later, her stage lights were going dark, her picture was off the company wall, and Arthur's name was the only signature the banks would accept. So how does a 59-year-old widower with a salt and pepper mustache and a 10-year-old sedan pull the rug out from under an arrogant executive without ever raising his voice? To understand how Victoria Thorne ended up staring at a dark screen on the biggest morning of her life, you have to go back to 6:15 that same morning. Thorne Marine and Energy Systems was preparing for what was supposed to be a royal coronation. They were announcing the $52 million acquisition of Apex Marine Components, a massive deal that was supposed to cement Victoria's reputation as a visionary leader who had outgrown her father's shadow. The main atrium smelled of fresh-cut orchids and $80 a pound espresso. Caterers in black aprons were arranging silver trays, TV camera crews were setting up heavy tripod legs on the polished granite, and the parking lot was lined with slick black town cars. And then there was Arthur. Arthur pulled his 10-year-old Navy sedan into the back corner of the lot, right near the loading dock bay where the cold harbor wind blew worst. He wore a gray suit he'd bought off the rack 6 years ago for his daughter Clara's high school graduation. It was clean, pressed, but worn soft at the cuffs. As he walked toward the side entrance holding a stainless steel travel mug he'd filled at his kitchen counter, 2 junior marketing managers in slim-fit suits chuckled into their cold brews. One of them made a crack about the dinosaur from Risk Assessment, brewing his own diner coffee to save $4. Arthur heard it. Of course he heard it. But when you've spent 3 decades inspecting heavy steel forgings for hairline stress fractures, you learn that small minds always mock small economies, usually right before their own balance sheets fall apart. He walked up to his 7th-floor office, set his satchel down, and logged into the compliance auditing system. He'd been working on routine pre-closing verifications for the Apex purchase. But when he opened the ledger reconciliation portal, 3 specific numbers popped up on his screen that made him stop mid-sip. First, a pool of $24 million in customer receivables, money owed to Thorne Marine by commercial shipyards, had been pledged as security for a short-term line of credit with Oakhaven First Bank. Nothing illegal about that on its own. Except Arthur noticed those exact same accounts receivable were already listed as primary collateral for a second, private bridge loan from a firm called Vance Global Capital. Pledging the same asset twice to 2 different lenders without disclosing it isn't a mistake, folks. That's a federal crime. Second, Arthur pulled up the risk authorization sign-off sheet for that double-pledged asset. Right there at the bottom was his own electronic signature, approving the dual collateral structure. Timestamp, 3:08 in the morning, 3 days prior. Arthur had been fast asleep in his recliner 3 towns over at 3:08 in the morning, with his 17-year-old daughter Clara sleeping down the hall and his phone charging on the kitchen counter. And third, buried on page 74 of the Vance Global Capital Loan Agreement was an automatic default clause. If any financial representation made by Thorn Marine proved untrue, Vance Global didn't just have the right to demand repayment, they had the right to immediately seize the company's core commercial turbine patents. The very patents Arthur's father-in-law had helped forge 40 years ago. Arthur didn't panic. He didn't yell. He printed out the 3:08 a.m. access log, slipped it into a manila folder, and walked down the hall to the corner office of Chief Financial Officer Julian Croft. Now, Julian Croft was 38, wore custom-tailored suits with silk pocket squares, and spoke in that super-smooth corporate cadence designed to sound like everything is under control even when the house is on fire. Arthur set the single printed page on Croft's glass desk. "Julian, we have a double pledge on the shipyard receivables. $24 million promised to Oakhaven and Vance Global at the same time. And somebody used my system credentials at 3 in the morning to sign off on it." Croft didn't even look up from his tablet for 5 seconds. When he finally did, he leaned back, smiled with his teeth, and said, "Arthur, it's 6:45 in the morning on the day of the biggest acquisition this firm has seen in 15 years. Don't go pulling red levers over administrative data alignment." "Data alignment?" Arthur's voice stayed lower than a slow river. "Julian, Oakhaven Bank installed an automated overnight reconciliation protocol last month when we expanded our operational credit. At midnight tonight, their servers are going to cross-match registered collateral claims across every institutional lender in the district. When that machine runs, it won't ask for a meeting. It will flag the double pledge, lock the credit line, and trigger a material default." Croft's smile thinned out just a fraction. He stood up, walked around his desk, and put a hand on Arthur's shoulder, that heavy, condescending touch men in power use when they want you to feel weak. "Arthur," Croft whispered softly, "you're a single father, right? Clara's applying to state colleges this spring, if I remember correctly. Good health coverage, a steady pension track, a flexible schedule that lets you get home for dinner, those are hard things to replace for a man touching 60. Victoria has already signed the acquisition certifications. The board is taking the stage in 4 hours. Do not turn a minor timing overlap into a personal catastrophe for yourself. Think about that for a second." That wasn't an explanation. That was a direct, pointed threat aimed right at a father's obligation to his child. What would you have done? Because a lot of people in Arthur's shoes, 5 years from retirement, raising a kid on one income, would have swallowed hard, walked back to their desk, and kept their mouths shut. Arthur didn't flinch. He looked at Croft's hand on his shoulder until Croft took it off. "A chief executive's signature can make a lie official, Julian," Arthur said evenly. "It just can't make it true. And a computer at midnight doesn't care whose name is on the letterhead." Arthur walked out of Croft's office and did the only thing the corporate compliance manual required. He triggered the strict remediation protocol. Under company bylaws, if an auditor reports a critical material defect in writing to the board, the chief legal officer, and the lending institution simultaneously, an official 8-hour remediation window opens. During those 8 hours, the company can self-disclose the error, pause the acquisition without legal penalty, and fix the collateral structure before the bank's automatic system flags it as fraud. It was a legal life raft. Arthur handed Thorn Marine the exact key they needed to save themselves from disaster. He went back to his desk, trusting the machine of proper governance to do its job. What Arthur didn't know was that Julian Croft had no intention of letting that report reach the older, principled board members. Croft intercepted the internal audit filing before it hit Chairman Samuel Harrison's desk. Then he walked straight into CEO Victoria Thorne's private dressing room on the top floor, where she was having her hair styled for the television cameras. Croft told Victoria a completely twisted story. He claimed Arthur Pendelton, a disgruntled, aging auditor angry about a delayed $100 travel reimbursement claim, was trying to hijack the acquisition, threatening to spread false rumors to the press unless he was given a massive payout before noon. Victoria was already riding high on adrenaline and pride. This acquisition was supposed to be her ultimate victory over the board members who had doubted her when her father died 3 years ago. She was in no mood to hear that a line auditor earning $80,000 a year was raising red flags on her big day. At 9:30, 30 minutes before the press conference, Victoria summoned Arthur to the main boardroom. When Arthur walked in, carrying his worn satchel and his manila folder, the scene was set like a courtroom. Victoria sat at the head of the long mahogany table. Croft was standing right behind her shoulder. Several key board directors were seated along the sides, along with Raymond Vance, the managing partner of Vance Global Capital, sitting quietly in a dark slate suit, watching like a wolf waiting for a fence to break. Arthur tried to hand the time-stamped access logs to Chairman Samuel Harrison. But Victoria cut him off before he could take 2 steps into the room. "Keep your paper, Arthur," she said, her voice echoing off the glass walls, cold and sharp. Julian filled me in. I must say, I'm almost impressed. I didn't think a man who spent 30 years sitting quietly in compliance had the nerve to pull a shakedown on the morning of my acquisition. Arthur paused. Victoria, this isn't a shakedown. The 8-hour remediation window opened when I filed the disclosure at 7:10 this morning. You have 5 hours left to pause the announcement, notify Oakhaven Bank, and correct the collateral allocation. If you do not, the automated audit sweep at midnight will freeze your operational accounts. Victoria leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her rings catching the morning light. You really think you can scare me with technical jargon? You're upset because your travel expense form for the Baltimore site visit, $100, got flagged by automated processing last week. That's what this is about, isn't it? A bitter old man who feels forgotten, trying to prove he still has his hand on the steering wheel. Victoria, Arthur said calmly, the $100 is irrelevant. The collateral is double-pledged. My signature was forged at 3 in the morning. Enough. Victoria barked. She stood up, reached into her designer leather handbag on the table, and pulled out a crisp, single $100 bill. The room went dead silent. Chairman Harrison looked uncomfortable, shifting in his leather armchair. Raymond Vance just tilted his head, a faint, cruel smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. Victoria walked around the long mahogany table, her red-soled heels clicking sharply against the polished floor until she was standing 3 feet from Arthur. She held the $100 bill between 2 manicured fingers, right at eye level. You want to talk about value, Arthur, she said, loud enough for every director in the room to hear. You think your little opinions are worth interrupting my $52 million moment? You're obsolete. You're a leftover relic from my father's era who couldn't adapt to how fast modern business moves. Then, with absolute deliberation, she let go of the bill. It fluttered through the air, turned twice, and landed flat on the floor, resting right against the toe of Arthur's scuffed leather shoe. There's your $100, Victoria said, her voice dropping into a cruel, quiet whisper. Pick it up. Take your stuff, and get out of my building. You're fired, Arthur. Effective right now. For insubordination, attempted extortion, and gross breach of contract. Croft let out a small, quiet exhale of satisfaction from the head of the table. A couple of the younger directors smirked. Arthur didn't look down at the money. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't turn red. He just looked at Victoria Thorne with a deep, weary stillness that made her smile flicker for just half a second. He checked his watch. It was 9:42 a.m. The self-disclosure window just closed, Arthur said, his voice flat, clear, and perfectly steady. I'm not threatening your future, Victoria. I'm telling you a fact. Your $150 million empire is already dead. You just haven't smelled the smoke yet. He turned to a young executive assistant standing near the door, a 30-year-old woman named Nina Mercer, who was clutching a digital recording tablet with white knuckles. Nina, Arthur said politely, please make sure the official board minutes reflect that I presented the compliance warning before the deadline, and that I refused to sign the altered asset schedule. Then Arthur turned, picked up his worn satchel, and walked out of the boardroom without touching that $100 bill. As soon as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, Nina Mercer quietly stepped forward, bent down, picked up the crisp $100 bill from the floor, slipped it into a clear plastic evidence envelope, and marked it into the official personnel termination file. Victoria saw her do it and snapped, throw that paper away, Nina. But Nina just tucked it under her tablet and walked quickly out the back exit. Remember that $100 bill in the plastic envelope, folks. Because that little piece of paper was about to become the most expensive mistake Victoria Thorne ever made. Arthur walked down to the lobby, handed his electronic security badge to the front guard, and stepped out into the cold, gray morning drizzle. He walked to his old Navy sedan, sat in the driver's seat, and took a slow, deep breath. His hands were completely steady. His phone rang on the dashboard console. It was Clara. Hey, Dad. How did the big presentation go? Did they listen to your risk report? Arthur looked at the high-rise glass tower reflected in his wet windshield. They heard it, sweetheart, he said softly. They just chose not to listen. But don't you worry about a thing. How's your studying going for the AP Physics exam? It's fine, Dad. Are you sure you're okay? Your voice sounds quiet. I'm perfectly fine, Clara. Just coming home early today. Let's make that pot roast tonight. He hung up, started the engine, and drove away. 2 hours later, at 11:30 a.m., the grand stage in the main atrium was bathed in bright white television lights. Victoria Thorne stood behind a sleek acrylic lectern bearing the Thorne Marine logo, smiling broadly into 4 live news cameras. Behind her, a massive LED screen displayed soaring financial projections and a slick, 3D graphic showing the Apex Marine Components deal joining the two companies. Today, Victoria announced into the microphone, her voice echoing through the packed atrium, we don't just acquire a company. We claim our rightful place as the dominant maritime defense contractor on the East Coast. The crowd of investors, journalists, and employees began to applaud. Victoria turned slightly to wave toward the executive balcony where Julian Croft was standing, holding a champagne glass. And right at that precise second, at 11:34 a.m., the massive digital screen behind her flickered. The high-resolution 3D graphic disappeared. In its place, 3 bright red, system-generated alert boxes popped up across the 30-foot display. System notice, Oakhaven First Bank, automated reconciliation hold. Credit facility number 4409, frozen. Reason, unverified multiple collateral registration detected. The applause died in a fraction of a second. The ambient hum of the room curdled into a sharp, nervous murmur. Victoria's smile froze. She turned around slowly, staring at the red letters blaring over her head. Up on the balcony, Julian Croft dropped his champagne glass. It shattered against the granite tile with a loud, ringing crack. Down in the front row, a senior representative from Apex Marine Components stood up, looked at his tablet, then looked up at Victoria with an expression of sudden, sharp hostility. Victoria, he said, loud enough for the news microphones to pick up, why is Oakhaven freezing your operational liquidity line during our closing announcement? It's a technical glitch. Victoria stammered, stepping away from the lectern, her face turning pale under the studio lights. Our IT department is resolving a server alignment issue. It wasn't a technical glitch. By 12:15 p.m., two major steel suppliers in Norfolk received automated credit risk notifications from their insurers. Within 20 minutes, both suppliers issued formal stop delivery orders on $36 million worth of raw turbine forgings already sitting on barges in the harbor. They demanded full cash payment in advance before another valve moved. The $52 million Apex acquisition didn't just stall. It disintegrated on live television. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Victoria was trapped in her top-floor office. Her phone was ringing off the hook with calls from panicked board members, angry institutional investors, and bank compliance attorneys. That's when Raymond Vance, the quiet lender from Vance Global Capital, walked into her office without knocking. He sat down across from her, unbuttoned his jacket, and laid a thick document on her desk. "Victoria," Vance said in a calm, soothing tone that masked absolute brutality, "Croft told me about your operational hiccup. Oakhaven is panicking because of some administrative noise generated by that auditor you let go this morning. But Vance Global is prepared to stand by you." Victoria looked at him, desperate for a lifeline. "What kind of terms, Raymond?" "We'll provide an emergency $25 million credit bridge to satisfy the suppliers and clear the Oakhaven hold," Vance said smoothly. "All we ask is a temporary pledge of your commercial turbine patents as primary security. Just until the noise clears up. Do you see the trap, folks?" Vance had known about the double-pledged collateral all along. He had purposely structured his bridge loan to push Thorn Marine into a position where Victoria would be forced to hand over the company's crown jewel patents just to keep the lights on for another 30 days. It was a predatory foreclosure scheme designed from the inside out. And Julian Croft was right in the middle of it. Croft leaned over Victoria's chair and whispered in her ear, "Sign it, Victoria. It's the only way to save the narrative. And we can blame the whole mess on Arthur Pendelton. We'll tell the press he intentionally fed corrupted data to Oakhaven out of spite after he was fired for incompetence." Victoria, cornered, terrified of looking like a failure, took the bait. At 4 p.m. that afternoon, Thorn Marine issued an official press statement. They announced that an internal audit had uncovered a deliberate act of corporate sabotage by a former mid-level compliance officer, Arthur Pendelton, who had been terminated earlier that day for gross misconduct and malicious manipulation of company records. Within 3 hours, that press release hit every regional business wire. By 7 o'clock that evening, Arthur was sitting at his kitchen table with Clara, eating pot roast, when his phone started blowing up with text messages from former colleagues. Arthur opened his laptop and read the headlines. "Former auditor accused of sabotaging Thorn Marine $52 million deal. Arthur Pendelton terminated for malicious corporate misconduct." Clara looked across the table at her father, her eyes wide with shock. "Dad, what is this? They're putting your name all over the news. They're calling you a criminal." Arthur looked at the screen. He saw his name, his 32-year reputation, dragged through the mud by the very executive he had tried to warn 6 hours earlier. Two local engineering firms that Arthur had spoken with earlier that week about potential consulting work sent him automated email notices within the hour, politely canceling his scheduled interviews. Did Arthur start pacing around the room shouting? Did he call Victoria and scream into the phone? No. He reached over, closed his laptop screen, took a sip of water, and looked at his daughter. "Clara," Arthur said softly, "when a building is constructed on bad foundation piers, the walls don't crack because somebody threw a stone at them. They crack because gravity doesn't take bribes. Let them talk for tonight." The next morning at 8:30, Arthur sat down in a small, quiet law office downtown across from attorney Robert Hayes. Hayes was 62 years old, had gray hair cut short, and had spent 35 years handling employment defense and corporate governance cases. He didn't wear fancy Italian suits, he wore tweed jackets with elbow patches and listened with his chin resting in his hand. Arthur opened his worn satchel, pulled out 3 neat manila folders, and laid them on Hayes's desk. In folder 1, the certified access logs showing his system credentials were used at 3:08 a.m., along with his phone's location data proving he was at home in bed. In folder 2, a printed copy of the 6-hour whistleblower remediation report he had filed at 7:10 a.m., stamped with an official corporate server confirmation code that proved it was delivered 2 full hours before he was fired. In folder 3, a detailed technical analysis of the compliance software Thorn Marine used. Arthur pointed to a specific line in the 3:08 a.m. access log. "See this, Robert? System tag, Cypress 14. Hayes leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "Cypress 14? What's that?" "It's an internal system protocol tag," Arthur explained, his voice calm, clear, and perfectly steady. "It indicates the version of our legacy compliance software that generated the approval. But the Cypress 14 software package was officially retired and erased from all central servers 3 weeks ago. The only place in the entire building where Cypress 14 software code was still installed on a local drive was on the desktop computer inside Julian Croft's private office. Whoever forged my signature used an outdated template from Croft's machine." Hayes sat back, his eyes widening slightly. He took off his reading glasses and let out a low whistle. "Arthur," Hayes said, "they didn't just fire you wrongfully under whistleblower protection laws. They committed defamation per se on live television while trying to cover up a felony double pledge. And you've just given me the exact technical fingerprint to prove the forgery and identify the source computer." Hayes reached for his desk phone. "Do you know what a digital forensic preservation order is, Arthur?" "I do," Arthur replied. "It freezes every server, every private text message, and every backdated email file across the entire executive network before their IT team can overwrite them." "Exactly," Hayes said, already dialing. "Let's give Victoria Thorne and Julian Croft something real to think about before lunch." Arthur simply nodded. He watched Hayes, a man who'd seen more than his share of corporate shenanigans, dial with a kind of grim satisfaction. The office, usually bustling, seemed to quiet itself around the weight of that single phone call. Hayes spoke in precise, clipped legal terms, outlining the scope of the order, specifying the servers, the email archives, the personal devices. It wasn't a request, it was an instruction. A legal hammer falling. Now, you have to understand something about Arthur. He wasn't a man who relished confrontation. Never had been. He preferred the quiet hum of a well-oiled machine, the satisfying click of a system falling into place. But he wasn't a man who shied from it either, not when the stakes were true. And for him, dignity, truth, and the good name of decent workers, those were always true stakes. That was Tuesday. By a little after 2 o'clock that afternoon, the news had hit Thorn Marine like a rogue wave. You could almost feel the ripple from Hayes's office. Hayes called Arthur, his voice buzzing with a professional glee. "Arthur, you wouldn't believe the frantic calls my office has been getting." Croft tried to block the order, citing proprietary information. Victoria Thorne herself called, demanding to know what this charade was all about. Hayes chuckled. "We politely informed them the order was already being served by the U.S. Marshal Service. Their IT director, poor fellow, is probably sweating through his shirt right about now, watching uniformed officers secure their servers." Arthur was back home by then, sitting at his kitchen table. The late afternoon sun was slanting through the window, painting stripes on his worn wooden floor. He wasn't celebrating. He just sat there, tracing the rim of his coffee mug. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a pocket compass, brass, aged to a dull, warm gleam, the glass a little scratched, but the needle still swung true. He'd carried it for decades. A gift from his father, who told him, "Always know where you stand, son." And always know which way is north. He ran his thumb over the cool metal, a small, private ritual. Victoria Thorne, on the other hand. She wasn't taking it quietly. Not Victoria. You see, she saw herself as a modern titan of industry, a woman who'd built a shipping empire on the legacy of her family's shipyard. But truth be told, she'd inherited a lot more than she'd built. She had a way of cutting corners and talking big, of dismissing anyone she deemed a relic from the old ways. And Arthur, in his practical work coat, with his hands that knew the difference between a loose bolt and a failing circuit, well, he was a relic in her eyes. So, the next morning, just as the sun was burning off the river fog, she staged her counterattack. A press conference, right there in the Thorne Marine lobby, with Croft standing stiffly beside her, looking like a man who'd just lost a very large poker hand. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt by a disgruntled former employee, Victoria declared, her voice ringing with indignation. Mr. Albright's accusations are baseless, and his lawsuit is a transparent effort to extort funds from a respected company. Thorne Marine stands by its commitment to integrity and our stellar safety record. She even managed to get out the phrase, "We will vigorously defend ourselves against these spurious claims." Croft then stepped up, his face grim. Mr. Albright was dismissed for gross negligence, a clear breach of protocol that jeopardized our compliance. The evidence is irrefutable. Any suggestion of forgery or cover-up is utterly ludicrous. We are confident the courts will see through this fabricated attack on our reputation. He even had the gall to accuse Arthur of fabricating the evidence he had presented. Can you believe it? Arthur heard all this from Hayes, who called him around 11. They're trying to spin it, Arthur. Trying to get ahead of the story before the forensic team even finishes their work. Standard playbook stuff. They're hoping to poison the well. Arthur just listened, again, his chin in his hand. He was quiet for a moment, and Hayes, used to Arthur's thoughtful pauses, waited. "Robert," Arthur finally said, his voice soft but steady, "do you remember when I told you about Cypress 14? The old software package, retired 3 weeks ago, only on Croft's machine," Hayes recited. "Yes, what about it?" "Their IT department," Arthur continued, "they're trying to buy time, aren't they? They'll claim a mistake, a technical glitch, with the timestamp, or that a rogue employee somehow accessed Croft's machine without Croft knowing." He paused. "But they won't be able to explain the Cypress 14 tag, not really. That's too specific, too embedded in the metadata. And they definitely won't be able to explain how the legacy system in Croft's office could have generated a current timestamp for a document before it was fired and after the system it ran on was supposedly retired." Hayes let out a slow breath. "You think they'll try to destroy the physical hard drive on Croft's machine?" "No," Arthur said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "That's too obvious, too easily traced to an obstruction charge, and the marshals would have already secured the main servers and network backups. Besides, they wouldn't want to lose all the data on Croft's machine, not if he's got other things hidden there they might need. No, their play will be a lot more subtle. They'll try to clone the drive, wipe a portion of the original, then restore it from the clone. Or they'll try to selectively delete the Cypress 14 executable and any associated log files, then claim it was never there. So you think they'll try to tamper with the evidence?" Hayes asked, his voice hardening. "Oh, they're not thinking about tampering with the evidence, Robert," Arthur corrected him, "not in the way you mean. They're thinking about cleaning it. Making it look like an honest mistake. And they'll need access to that specific machine to do it. The one in Croft's office. And here's the part Hayes, and certainly Victoria Thorne, couldn't have known about Arthur. He didn't just understand the software, he understood the people who designed and implemented it. He'd helped build the system that Thorne Marine, and a dozen other companies, relied on, back when he wasn't just the old IT guy, but a quiet architect of critical infrastructure. He knew the weak points, the backdoor protocols, the ghost files that only the original engineers knew to look for. And he knew the minds that would try to exploit them. Then we need to send in our own forensic team, Hayes said, already thinking ahead. Under court order, of course. Get them in there before Thorn Marine's IT department can even look sideways at that machine again. Precisely, Arthur said. He paused, his gaze drifting back to the brass compass in his hand. And tell them to check the _temp directory. Not just the main system files. No matter how clean they think they've made it, there's always a breadcrumb. Always a shadow of what was there. Hayes was silent for a moment. Then he let out a low whistle, a sound that conveyed a deep respect. Arthur, he said, you're always 3 steps ahead, aren't you? Arthur just smiled faintly and polished the compass with his thumb. Just trying to know which way is north, Robert. And that, you see, was the quiet truth of it. While Victoria Thorne was busy trying to bulldoze her way through a legal crisis, Arthur was navigating with a precision she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Piece by quiet piece. And that quiet navigation. It started in earnest the very next morning. Now, you picture this, Robert Hayes and his team, 3 sharp young forensic specialists, all in crisp suits, walking into the gleaming lobby of Thorn Marine at precisely 8:30 a.m. Court order in hand. They were expecting resistance, sure. But what they got was something a little more polite. Ms. Thorne has cleared your access, Mr. Hayes, the stern-faced head of IT, a man named Henderson, said, not a flicker of welcome in his eyes. Henderson looked like he'd spent his whole career trying to forget everything Arthur had ever taught him. However, due to unforeseen network upgrades, the specific server for Mr. Croft's office is currently isolated for optimization. He even managed to sound sincere. Almost. Hayes felt the familiar prickle of frustration. Isolated? For how long? Henderson consulted a tablet with a practiced sigh. Potentially, for the remainder of the week. Critical system updates, you understand. What a load of baloney. Hayes knew it, and so did anyone with half an ounce of common sense. They weren't upgrading anything, they were buying time. Time to scrub whatever Arthur had warned them about. Hayes got back to the quiet office they'd set up, his jaw tight. He picked up his phone, dialing Arthur's number. They're stonewalling us, Arthur, he said, skipping the pleasantries. Claiming Croft's server is offline for network optimization. Says it'll be days before we can even touch it. There was a long silence on Arthur's end. Hayes could almost hear the gears turning, the quiet calculation. Did they offer you access to any other machines? Arthur finally asked. Oh, sure, Hayes grumbled. A whole bank of general-use terminals. All perfectly clean, I'm sure. They're trying to make us look like we're dragging our feet, wasting time on clean machines while the one we need sits offline. Right, Arthur said, a different kind of quiet now, a knowing quiet. Tell me, Robert, are their main data archives still accessible? The big server racks in the back. Yes, they gave us access to the primary servers, Hayes confirmed. But Henderson's IT folks are glued to us. Watching every keystroke. And they've explicitly denied access to anything labeled Croft or Project Cypress. Good, Arthur said, and Hayes blinked. Good. Here's what I want your team to do. Find the main network router for the 4th floor. It's probably labeled Thorn 4 Core RTR. It'll be tucked away in a wiring closet, maybe behind a locked door, but it's part of the general access they gave you to the main archives. It's how Croft's machine would have talked to the rest of the world. Hayes grabbed a notepad, already writing. Okay. Router. Got it. Now, once you're in the same physical space as that router, Arthur continued, his voice dropping slightly, I need you to open a command line on one of those clean, general-use terminals they gave you. And I want you to run a very specific command. It's an old diagnostic protocol. One I built in for network health checks, years ago, when the whole system was first installed. Most of the newer IT folks won't even know it exists, let alone how to trigger it remotely. Hayes could feel the shift, the hum of something unseen unfolding. What command? Arthur gave him a string of characters and numbers, a cryptic sequence that meant nothing to Hayes but sounded like pure code. It won't directly access Croft's machine, Robert. Not in the way they're expecting. But what it will do is force a network-wide log dump from that router. A dump of every packet, every connection, every single digital whisper that passed through it for the last 90 days. Including traffic from Croft's offline machine. And specifically, I want you to filter for anything containing the string Cypress 14. Hayes leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. You mean, a snapshot of its network activity, even if the machine itself is offline? Precisely, Arthur confirmed. It'll look like you're just running a system-wide diagnostic. Henderson's team won't bat an eye. They'll just see you gathering general network data. But those logs will hold every attempt Croft made to communicate, every file transfer, every interaction with the Cypress 14 executable. Even the attempts to delete it. He paused, and Hayes could hear a soft clink on Arthur's end. He knew, without being told, that Arthur was holding that brass compass again. It's like listening to the echoes in a long empty room, Robert, Arthur said, a touch of something distant in his voice. The room might be quiet now, but the walls still remember the conversations. He hadn't just built the network, he'd built the memory into it. A digital memory that even Victoria Thorne, with all her modern consultants and her network optimization, couldn't erase. Not yet, anyway. Hayes's team moved fast. They found the wiring closet, surprisingly unlocked, just like Arthur predicted it might be if they were given general access to the floor's network infrastructure. One of the young specialists, a bright woman named Elena, typed in Arthur's arcane command sequence. Henderson, watching over her shoulder, just shrugged when she explained it was a routine network health check for overall system stability. He barely registered the filtered output beginning to scroll across her screen. But Elena knew. She saw the patterns, the data streams, the specific timestamps linking back to Cypress 14 activity. She saw the ghost in the machine. A ghost that Arthur had placed there, decades ago, a silent witness to everything. And so, piece by quiet piece, without ever stepping foot inside Thorne Marine's offices, Arthur was already dismantling Victoria Thorne's carefully constructed wall of deniability. He wasn't just navigating, he was guiding them through a labyrinth he'd built himself. He was already north. Day 14 of the audit. Or, if you were looking at Victoria Thorne's master calendar, exactly 58 hours before the Maritime Board vote. Now, you have to understand something about late nights in a corporate headquarters when a panic sets in. It doesn't sound like alarms or sirens. It sounds like a single keyboard tapping too fast, and the sour smell of burnt pot coffee floating down a carpeted hallway. At 11:15 p.m., Henderson's chief analyst finally woke up. He had been running a standard bandwidth check on the local subnet when he caught Elena's lingering diagnostic query. He didn't understand the legacy protocols, very few people under 40 did, but he knew enough to see that someone was reading dark space. Space that was supposed to be empty. Panic is a funny thing. When a man like Henderson realizes his six-figure consulting contract is exposed, he doesn't pause to ask polite questions. He cleans up. By 11:22 p.m., Henderson had triggered a forced zero-fill purge on sub-basement server rack 04. That was the physical machine housing Croft's old drive mirrors. A total data scrub. In 30 minutes, every bit of digital trace evidence from Cyprus 14 would be cooked into non-recoverable heat. 3 miles away, in a dark hotel room overlooking the harbor, Robert Hayes saw the red alert flash on his monitoring tablet. His heart hit his ribs like a sledgehammer. He dialed Arthur immediately. "Arthur," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. They caught the mirror query. "Henderson just authorized an unannounced hardware wipe on B2 Rack 04. The script is running. We've got 22 minutes before those drives are completely sanitized." Now, picture Arthur sitting in his kitchen. No fluorescent lights, just the warm yellow glow of a small desk lamp beside his rotary phone. He didn't jump up. He didn't shout. He took a slow sip of black tea, set the porcelain cup back onto its saucer with a gentle clink, and picked up that heavy brass compass resting beside his old leather notebook. "Robert," Arthur said, his tone as even as a millpond at sunrise. "Do you have your field kit in the utility vehicle?" "Yes, but that entire basement level is locked down." "Listen to me," Arthur interrupted gently. "You don't need to go into the main server vault. Victoria had those glass partitions built 3 years ago so her foreign investors could admire the blinking blue lights. She thinks data lives in shiny rooms. It doesn't. It lives in copper and iron." Arthur turned the compass in his palm, feeling the deep, worn groove near the hinge, the one he'd carved with a pocketknife back during the blizzard of '88 when the main shoreline snapped. "Walk down to floor B2, Arthur instructed. Past the new HVAC compressors. Behind the secondary fire riser, there is an old steel utility hatch painted slate gray. It's labeled Drainage Access 03. "Drainage?" Hayes asked, already running down the emergency stairwell, his rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the polished concrete. "It was never drainage," Arthur said warmly. "In November of 1991, Thorn Marine tried to outsource the line maintenance. They brought in a crew from Chicago that wanted to pull all the old analog copper out of the walls to cut costs. I told Victoria's father it was a mistake. He didn't listen. So, after my shift ended at 6 o'clock, I stayed behind. Spent $48 of my own money on industrial terminal strips and a heavy junction box. I tapped the main feed before it reached the central distributor, and I ran a secondary line behind that access panel." Hayes reached the B2 corridor, breathing hard. The air down here tasted of stale dust and ozone. He slipped past the heavy fire door, moved behind the roaring air handling units, and spotted it, a rusted gray hatch, half hidden behind a stack of folded plastic pallets. "I'm at the panel," Hayes whispered, pulling a multi-tool from his coat pocket. "The lock was cheap when I put it on," Arthur said quietly over the line. "Give the latch a sharp strike with the heel of your hand." Hayes struck it once. The rusted latch snapped open with a dry clack. Inside, nestled beneath 30 years of gray dust and cobwebs, wasn't a modern fiber line. It was a dense, beautifully organized loom of thick copper wiring, anchored to a heavy slate terminal block, each lug marked in Arthur's precise, steady handwriting with an indelible chinograph pencil. "Clip your capture box across terminals 4 and 7, Arthur guided him. "That line sits upstream of Henderson's purge command. He's wiping the display terminal, Robert. He isn't wiping the bridge." At 11:38 p.m., upstairs in the modern glass server room, Henderson stood over his analyst's shoulder, watching a green progress bar reach 100%. Asterisk drive wipe complete. Overwrite standard DoD 5220.22M verified. Asterisk Henderson let out a long breath and loosened his silk tie. "Clean," he murmured to the empty room. "Not a trace left." Down in the dark damp of B2, Hayes watched his ruggedized tablet come alive with a steady, roaring waterfall of green data streams. 11:41 p.m. 44 gigabytes of unencrypted system traffic, pulled directly from the physical copper before Henderson's software wipe could choke it out. And right at the top of the incoming log, glowing bright in the dark panel alcove, was a transaction stamp from 3 months prior. Timestamp 3:14 a.m. A manual override code for the company's offshore emergency reserve fund, signed not by Croft, not by an anonymous system administrator, but by Victoria Thorne's personal cryptographic key. Hayes leaned his head back against the cold concrete wall, a breathless laugh escaping his throat. "Arthur, you didn't just save the log. You found the master key." Over the phone line, there was a long, quiet pause. Just the gentle sound of the old man setting his brass compass down on the wooden tabletop. "Victoria always believed the past was something you could throw away when you were finished with it," Arthur said softly. "She forgot that somebody had to lay the foundation before she could build her tower." "Victoria always believed the past was something you could throw away when you were finished with it," Arthur said softly. "She forgot that somebody had to lay the foundation before she could build her tower." Now, Robert Hayes, he just stood there, leaning against that cold concrete, the weight of a lifetime of engineering finally settling on him. This wasn't just a log. This wasn't just a signature. This was the blueprint to everything. Arthur hadn't just saved a few files, he'd laid a tripwire 30 years ago and waited. And you could hear it in his voice, even over a crackling phone line. He wasn't triumphant. He was tired. Hayes took a deep breath. So, the offshore fund, it wasn't just a contingency. It was an escape hatch, wasn't it? There was another long, quiet pause. The kind of pause that tells you a whole story without a single extra word. "Her father was always a worrier," Arthur finally said, his voice a low rumble. "He wanted a way to protect the company, come what may. A rainy day fund, he called it. His daughter, she just saw a private vault. A personal piggy bank with no questions asked." Hayes looked at the glowing timestamp, 3:14 a.m., Victoria Thorne, signing off on a manual override for a 9-figure reserve fund, 3 months ago. What had she been up to? And more importantly, what was she going to do now? It was almost 3 a.m. when Hayes finally emerged from the echoing concrete of B2, the tablet clutched tight. He and Arthur had spent the next hour just mapping it out. The raw data stream was a mess, but Arthur's deep knowledge of the old system's architecture was like a master key to a labyrinth. He'd helped Hayes filter, categorize, and prioritize. They hadn't just found an override. They'd found a series of transactions, small at first, then larger, moving out of the emergency fund, rerouted through a shell company in the Caymans. Money draining away, bit by bit. Hayes drove straight to a diner he knew, tucked away behind the old shipping docks, the kind of place where the coffee was strong enough to peel paint and nobody asked questions at 4 a.m. He needed a secure connection, a proper workstation. He plugged in, the data screaming across his screen, translating the raw hexadecimal into legible ledgers. And here's the thing you have to understand about Victoria Thorne. She wasn't stupid. She was arrogant. She thought her digital footprint was invisible. But she'd made one crucial mistake: she underestimated the man who'd built the very ground she walked on. Arthur had designed those old copper lines to be redundant, yes, but also watchful. Every major override, every direct access to the emergency fund, even through the modern system, left a faint electromagnetic ghost on that specific copper artery. A ghost that Henderson, with all his fancy software, couldn't touch. As dawn broke, painting the greasy diner window in muted grays and yellows, Hayes had a clear picture. Over $23 million, moved in 3 separate tranches. Each one signed, digitally, by Victoria Thorne. And the final tranche? Just 2 weeks ago. "She's emptying it," Hayes murmured into his coffee, his voice rough with lack of sleep. He called Arthur. She's trying to bleed it dry before the auction. If we wait, there'll be nothing left to save. Arthur's voice was calm, steady. I suspected as much, Robert. She's accelerating her exit strategy. She always preferred a clean break to a messy one. He paused. Hayes could hear the faint click of the compass being picked up, the soft scrape of metal on wood. She needs that money legitimized, brought back into a seemingly clean account. She'll try to run it through an acquisition, a dummy shell buying a small, struggling company, then folding it into Thorn Corporation. It's an old trick, but effective, if you can clean the paper trail fast enough. An acquisition? Hayes sat bolt upright. But there haven't been any announcements, no SEC filings. Not yet. But keep your eyes open. There's a small, family-owned engineering firm in upstate New York, Sterling Innovations, that Thorn Corp has been sniffing around for months. Old man Sterling, he's in his 80s, looking to sell. Cash deal, no public offering. Just the kind of target Victoria would choose to bury a large sum quickly. Hayes spent the whole next day, day 2, digging. He tracked down Sterling Innovations. Small, solid reputation, specializing in precision tooling. A perfect, unassuming target. He found their corporate filings, their financials. And then he hit a wall. No public records of a pending acquisition by Thorn Corporation. Nothing in the news, nothing in the industry trades. That evening, exhausted, Hayes called Arthur again. Nothing, Arthur. Not a whisper about Sterling. Could you be wrong? Patience, Robert. Victoria is good at keeping secrets. Especially when she's trying to hide something this inconvenient. There was a rustle on Arthur's end, then a soft thud. My father, bless his soul, he had a saying. If you want to know what's really going on, don't watch the stage. Watch the stagehands. Meaning, don't look at the big public announcements. Look at the logistics. The small details that have to move first. Logistics. Freight. Specialized equipment. Sterling Innovations uses a particular type of beryllium copper alloy for their high-precision instruments. Very specific vendor, out of Rhode Island, Oceanic Metals. And that vendor only ships with one carrier, Atlantic Haulers. Expensive, but they're meticulous. Now, if Sterling Innovations was about to be acquired, and its inventory moved, or its assets liquidated, you'd see a surge in Atlantic Haulers activity to and from Sterling's address. Hayes felt a spark ignite. It was old school. Analog. Exactly the kind of blind spot Victoria, with her digital focus, would ignore. The next morning, day 3, Hayes made some calls. Not to Atlantic Haulers directly, that would spook them. But to a few old contacts he knew in the freight industry, people who could sniff the wind. He described a hypothetical client, a big account, looking for similar shipping patterns, asking about surge capacity. He used a burner phone, spoke in vague terms. And within an hour, he got a call back. Funny you should ask, pal, the voice on the other end said, a rough rumble. Atlantic Haulers just put in an order for 7 extra flatbeds, long haul, on standby. All of them routed for next week. And guess where the primary pickup is? Hayes didn't need to ask. He could feel the cold dread and the thrilling certainty in his gut. Sterling Innovations, he whispered. Bingo, the contact confirmed. Full liquidation capacity, they called it. Big payday for Atlantic, but they're moving fast. Sounds like someone stripping the company down to the foundations. The game had just accelerated. Victoria Thorn wasn't just thinking about an acquisition, she was already clearing the shelves. The auction, the one set to define Thorn Corp's future, was in 5 days. And she was dismantling another company, potentially laundering $23 million of her father's rainy day fund, all before anyone could stop her. Hayes dialed Arthur's number, his fingers trembling slightly. "Arthur, she's doing it. She's already moving." The old man's voice was as steady as ever. "Of course she is, Robert. Victoria always was one for getting ahead of herself. Her father used to say she was like a high-performance engine, powerful, but prone to stripping the gears if you let her run unchecked." Hayes heard the gentle, familiar sound of the brass compass clicking softly into its worn leather case. "Now, we need to apply the brakes. Now, you gotta picture it." 5 days later, the Thorncorp atrium, usually a quiet cathedral of glass and steel, was buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest for the Sterling Innovations asset auction. Victoria Thorne, sharp as a tack in a power blue suit, was at the podium, a smug smirk plastered on her face. She looked like she owned the world. Hayes and Arthur. They were tucked away in the third row, quiet, just watching. The bidding for Sterling's crown jewel, its proprietary server farm, a massive piece of infrastructure valued at $15 million, began. Victoria was halfway through announcing the winning bid when Hayes, holding a manila envelope, stood up. "Excuse me, Miss Thorne," he said, his voice cutting through the room, just enough to catch everyone's attention. "I just want to confirm Lot 217, the server farm, is physically present and accounted for." Victoria's smile tightened, a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Of course, Mr. Hayes. What a silly question." "Because," Hayes continued, pulling a stack of printouts from his envelope, the paper rustling loud in the suddenly hushed room, "according to these Atlantic haulers' manifests, invoice #ATLH 7019, those servers left the Sterling facility at 2:14 a.m., 3 days ago. They're currently in a warehouse in Bakersfield, awaiting international transport. You can't sell what you don't possess, Ms. Thorne." The room exploded. Victoria Thorne's face drained of color, going from a triumphant flush to stark white. Her grand plan, her carefully constructed narrative, crumbled right there, in front of every major player, every investor she was trying to impress. Arthur, beside Hayes, merely gave a small, knowing nod. The silence that followed the initial uproar was deafening. You could almost hear Thorncorp's stock price plummeting in real time. Later that evening, Victoria found Hayes alone in his cubicle, packing his few things. Her sharp suit looked crumpled, her hair slightly disheveled, and her usual arrogance was completely gone. "Robert," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet his gaze. I made a terrible mistake. I dismissed your wisdom, undermined my father's legacy, and nearly destroyed everything for my own ambition." Her voice broke, thick with shame. "I'm so profoundly sorry for how I treated you, for the disrespect, for everything. It wasn't just words, it was a raw, genuine confession, stripped bare." The very next morning, Victoria held a press conference. She stood there, no notes, no spin. She publicly confessed to the premature liquidation, the deceptive practices, taking full responsibility. Then, looking straight into the cameras, she said, "I want to publicly apologize to Robert Hayes. A man whose integrity and quiet strength I foolishly ignored and undervalued. He saved this company from my own recklessness, embodying the true values my father taught us all." It was a moment of stark, painful humility that began to mend the fractured trust in Thorncorp. Thorncorp endured, though not without its scars. Victoria, to her credit, started a real overhaul, not just of the company's finances, but of its very soul. She brought back the Bold Guard Advisory Board, with Arthur as its honored chairman, finally getting the respect he deserved. Hayes, well, he didn't want a corner office. He stayed in his old cubicle, near the window, but now, people actually sought out his advice. They listened. One quiet afternoon, Hayes was alone, the sun streaming through the glass. He polished his brass compass, its worn weight a comforting anchor in his palm. He thought of Arthur, now happily fishing by Lake Lanier, finally at peace. And of Elias Thorne, the man who'd first showed him that compass, who taught him some things, like loyalty, integrity, and a good reputation, are worth more than gold. It turns out, the quiet forces are often the ones holding everything together. You know, it's easy to overlook what doesn't shout for attention. To confuse quiet strength with weakness, or a lifetime of experience with irrelevance. But some people, they just keep doing the right thing, day after day, year after year, even when nobody's watching. And sometimes, it takes a public jolt, a real humbling, for everyone else to finally see the steady bedrock they've been standing on. To finally realize the quiet guardian was there, protecting them, the whole time.